What's up, hobby friends? In this video, I want to talk about my Ossiarch Bonereapers, the OBR. Sort of why I wanted to collect the army originally, what inspired me to build the army the way I did, and then why I retired them almost immediately before even getting them fully painted and on the tabletop. So this would have been in the tail end of 2019, call it November or December. Games Workshop had teased and released the OBR, and I was really enthusiastic about collecting them. They were part of the larger Death collection that Games Workshop has, and I figured if I was going to collect a second army, why not make it Death? Keep growing that massive collection and have models that could crisscross back and forth. Narratively, the OBR were essentially Nagash's answer to the Stormcast Eternals, only instead of being great warrior spirits imbued into suits of golden armor, custodes, these were the bones of the mortal realm's greatest warriors, infused into a single body and then carried across or multiplied across an entire legion. I thought the visuals were very, very cool. Armored elite skeletons, a very tiny elite army, or what was supposed to be a very tiny elite army, and I was fully on board. I ended up picking up a full 2,500 points of the army. That is including some extra pieces and things that I didn't end up actually painting in the final collection. And then, you know, the book, the war scroll cards, things like that. I was fully on board. I ended up having the army built, and then I played about I think a dozen games in the months of January to March of 2020 before COVID hit. So I did get a sense of what I thought or what I felt the army played like. I played, I think, about 3 or 4 games with Petrifex Elite, and I ended up switching to the Ossiarch Lords because I felt that having more options in the movement phase, being able to maximize the Cavalos and take battalions built around cavalry would have been more my playstyle. But I think the way the army plays, the core playstyle or mechanic of the army still ended up being the same. And I'll cover more on that later in the video on why this army really isn't for me, why I found them kind of boring to play, and why I ended up retiring them pretty much immediately. Games Workshop, when they designed the OBR, they essentially mixed a variety of styles, I guess, from more historical genres. And I think their idea was that because Nagash was infusing the bones of the greatest warriors in the mortal realms, that because these warriors would come from different backgrounds, different cultures, that this army would essentially be a blending of those styles. So you see some Roman influence in the way that the armor is plated. You see some Japanese samurai influence, particularly in some of the helmets of the Cavalos and the Immortus. You've got some Chinese stylings with some of the falchions, especially in the Stalkers and the Immortus. And I really like that. I decided to lean into the more Japanese styling, mainly because of the heads. When I saw the Rictus Grin heads of the Mortek Guard in particular, I wasn't really a fan of it. I didn't like the way they looked. And thankfully, the Cavalos comes with a couple of extra heads that you don't use for the Death Riders. So I think it comes with 7 heads that are themed in the samurai helmet style. So I managed to source 10 extra heads from a couple of friends who also started OBR, and I managed to get 10 Mortek equipped like samurai. I had all my Cavalos built with the same heads. And then for the Stalkers, because they give you 2 head options, one with the forehead facing for the Stalkers and then the samurai helmet for the Immortus, I just used that same samurai helmet across all of them, all my Stalkers and my Immortus. And then I also used the big falchion sword for the Immortus Guard instead of a halberd as well, to keep that samurai sword motif going, like a katana. I also ended up scratch building a lot of the Sashimono, which is the Japanese back banner on all the warriors. And this was done very, very simply using all the extra spears that ended up being in both the Mortek Guard and Cavalos kits. And some of the larger spears from the Cavalos I used to create the banners for the Stalkers and the Immortus Guard. I think the only characters and models that ended up being not converted were Catacross and the Crawler and some of the heroes. I think even my Neferata conversion is a mix of all 3 Mortarchs in terms of the pieces to just make her a little more interesting. Rules-wise, I was fielding her as my Manfred, but I'm in love with Lamian and the Lamian bloodline, and if you've seen my Crimson Court video, you know how much I love them. So I wanted a female Mortarch, which meant using the Neferata body. I ended up using, I believe it was Manfred's Steed, which meant having to convert up Neferata's hand and the reins to match up Manfred's Steed. And then I liked the Von Karstein Scythe because I wanted to have some tie into my Nighthaunt, which are very scythe heavy. So I ended up using the Von Karstein Scythe, which meant converting that into Neferata's hand. So he was really a blend of all three models and ended up being actually a lot of fun to paint. I hadn't done, admittedly, much research in terms of the Japanese clans when I was sort of picking the iconography, and I had basically based the aesthetic of the army just in terms of the markings off of one cool piece of art that I'd found on Google. And I guess a friend had pointed out afterwards that, oh, this was the Takeda clan. And he pointed out after I painted up, I think, the 10 Mortek. And I had originally planned to do different markings for all the different units, but once I dove more into it and looked more into the clans, I realized that it didn't really make sense to vary up the banners that much. So I ended up using the same Takeda markings, which is the diamond pattern across all the banners. And I basically used yellow for the basic infantry, and then I used red to mark out the Hecatos, so the unit champions, and then all the Stalkers under Mortis Guard also have red banners. And this was a way to also, from a gameplay perspective, mark out this is the champion, and I can measure my AoEs or my aura abilities from this one model. And it was very easy to find. So I got the army built in December of 2019 and was able to get about a dozen games playing as OBR between the months of January and March of 2020. And I also played a couple of games, probably about a dozen, using my Legion of Grief against them. And I think one of them was actually in a tournament. Quite a few people in either our gaming group or our gaming area actually also picked up OBR. And so there was no shortage of opponents in terms of being able to get games against the new army. And I played, I think, about maybe 6 games as Petrifex. And then I ended up switching over and playing 6 games as Ossiarch. And then I played a lot of games against the OBR who all ran Petrifex. And essentially what I was finding was that the army, regardless of the legion you picked, basically played the same. And it was all about committing to, I guess, a plan of action in deployment phase. And then you're pushing forward to reach combat. And if you're spamming Mortek Guard, which I think was the most competitive build at the time, you're basically playing a game of attrition. And this wasn't really what I was looking for in the army. A lot of the lists I was seeing were essentially Catacross, a lead, or another caster like a Soul Mason, 2 or 3 blocks of Mortek Guards. So you're bringing like 20 or 30 guys per unit, so 60 to whatever guys. A couple of crawlers in the back as your artillery, and then maybe a unit of Stalkers or some Harvesters as a countercharge and support unit. And the army was neither elite, it wasn't fast, it was boring to play against, boring to play with. And even my build, which centered around Cavalos, I brought a big block of 15, a unit of 5, and then the Cavalos lead in the Death Riders Battalion, still felt like it played the same way. It was a lot faster because of the movement. In Ossiarch, they could retreat and charge more readily, and they were fast. They could cross the board very quickly, but they weren't anywhere near as tanky or as durable, and they still only hit on 3s, wounded on 4s. What made them worse, especially in Ossiarch, was losing the extra rend that Petrifex got. And so I didn't enjoy playing the army. It was very boring, and every game ended up feeling the same. You deployed your guys, you pushed forward to get into combat, and then you just grinded your opponents down. They couldn't hit hard enough with their fast units, and their heavy hitters were too slow and too fragile, and would essentially evaporate if they couldn't get the charge or were shot apart. I always brought a big block of 6 Stalkers, and I found that if they didn't get the charge off, they would essentially die. They were way too fragile, or they just didn't do enough damage if you took the reroll saves. And then because I was running them in Ossiarch, I couldn't get the +1 save, so they were only a 4-up save. I think, looking back though, it wasn't all bad. I think the army was a good experience playing a different a different battle tome in Age of Sigmar, and my experience with OBR essentially helps me rule out a lot of other armies that want to play the same way. So right off the bat, I don't need to play Iron Jaws, or I don't need to play Fire Slayers, Ogres, Goblins. Anything that relies on just attrition or just pushing into you and then rolling dice for combat is pretty much out of my wheelhouse. So even if I wanted to collect or to paint or play those armies, I know from my experience that they're not going to be the thing for me. So I played the army for 3 months. I played against the army. I got enough experience under my belt to decide that the army wasn't for me. And right around the time, I think it was the beginning of March, before COVID hit and before everything went into lockdown, I think I'd already made at least a subconscious decision that I wasn't going to play the army. I wasn't going to collect them. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to sell them. I still think the army looks cool, and I'm still holding out hope that Games Workshop may rewrite the battle tome or may re-release new units that quote-unquote give the army new life and sort of change up the way that the army plays. So I chose to paint the army even though I knew that I wasn't going to actually keep playing them. So it's funny, I played the army and it was unpainted, and now that it's painted, I actually haven't put it on the tabletop since. Although that might be a lie. I might have gotten one game in with them right after I'd fully finished painting them. This would have been before, because Ontario's been doing rolling lockdowns, and I think in the gap in between, while we were still doing our social distancing, I snuck in one game with a friend in my close social circle, and I played against his troll army. Army was still just as bad, just as boring as I remembered, and they went back on the shelf. I ended up choosing a very vibrant green color scheme, and I chose to do non-metal metal for the trim and the weapons. Not like the most polished work, but enough for the quote-unquote tabletop, even though they will never see play. I think because they weren't intended to actually be played very often, I also chose to dry brush all the bone in the army. I wanted something quick and easy that would let me tackle the army relatively quickly. And because this was one of my first projects in lockdown, I was trying to use all this free time I'd suddenly had because I actually lost my job when the lockdown hit, to try and clear out some of my backlog, my pile of shame, and just push through some projects I've been sitting around that I hadn't actually gotten around to, because between working full-time and then doing my part-time MBA in the evenings, I hadn't had a lot of hobby time in the years prior, from like 2017 to like 2018, 2019. I think looking back and knowing how long lockdown would have hit, I maybe should have spent a little more time on the bone. From like 3, 4, 5 feet away, if you compare them to something like Catacross, where I did spend a lot more time hand painting and hand blending all the bone, you really can't tell the difference, although it's when you get up close, like within like 6 inches or a foot, that you can really see the quality difference. Especially on the models where I dry brushed the bone, but then hand blended all the armor and the non-metal metal. There is a distinct, I think, quality gap that makes the model look not quite as crisp, although I think as a collection overall, army still looks cool, and my goal wasn't to paint an amazing display piece or some sort of centerpiece army. So I'm happy with how I think overall the visual or the aesthetics of the army turned out, and it'll look great for the collection. I think the hardest part about painting this army was actually the trim. It was a mistake of me to choose to do non-metal metal for an entire army. Very, very ambitious. And when I was doing the weapons, it was actually a lot of fun. I found the weapons particularly easy and quick to do. The trim wasn't hard, but there was a lot of them. And this was compounded by the fact that I also chose to do the samurai helmets on every single model. And I think the helmets themselves have as much trim or more so than the rest of the models. If you count shoulder pads, chest plates, shields, weapons, The helmet has as much trim as the rest of the armor on the body. There's also some of it on the Sashimono and stuff, so it ended up being a lot more tedious than I thought it would, and I ended up leaning more into something that was quick and dirty, and not the most polished non-metal metal, just to help speed things along. The Cavalos in particular, getting all 20 of them done was actually quite a bit of a chore, because not only were you painting a rider, you were painting the cavalry, and the cavalry also has armor plates with non-metal metal trim. So between that, and then they have their horseshoes, which I also painted in non-metal metal silver, it was just a nightmare. But I actually managed to tackle all the infantry at the very, very beginning, and I was able to save all the fun units, all the heroes, the crawler, the stalkers, and the mortis guard to the very, very end. So once I'd gotten the cavalos and the mortis guard out of the way, it was actually quite a bit of fun to paint the bigger, more elite units and have a little more fun with their weapons and the armor, and especially with the heroes, spending a little more time painting the detail work. I think my favorite model still has to be Catacross. He's one of the reasons why I also wanted to play OBR. I think the army aesthetic as a whole is very, very cool, but Catacross himself is a phenomenal model. I think he's one of Games Workshop's earliest diorama pieces, right along the lines of the Funeral of St. Catherine's, Glottos, things like that. And despite being, he's not a big model by any means, but there's a lot going on. Because it's all separate pieces, you're able to tackle each component as an individual model. And so he was actually quite a lot of fun to paint. I spent a lot of time hand blending all the bone, and I think it turned out great. And I think this model is the reason why I haven't sold the army yet. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more awesome weekly content. You can also follow my Instagram at SirJohnTheHo for daily updates on my hobby projects. And if you want to get access to all my full-length exclusive painting tutorials, you can subscribe to my Patreon, and I'll drop the link in the video description below. Until next time, happy hobbying.